Okay, down to the nitty-gritty of policy, legislation, and reform. I'd just like to quote Geoff on when he said, "A place people want to live is a place people want to invest." I think that we should keep this in mind as we pursue this discussion on policy, legislation, and reform, because we can make it happen. Peter Flesher will be moderating this next presentation of panelists, and Peter is the first executive director of the statewide 44-member Empire State Future Coalition. He started this role in February of 2008. The Empire State Future seeks the economic revitalization of New York's main streets, town centers, and urban areas by advancing the principles of smart growth and land use and development decision-making. In 2010, Empire State Future was a key partner in the successful effort to pass the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act, a New York State bill requiring many state entities to align their infrastructure spending with stated smart growth criteria. In 2011, ESF is focused on land banking authority and complete streets legislation, as well as the robust implementation of the Smart Growth Bill. From 2003 to 2007, Peter was the Senior Vice President at the Empire State Development Corporation's Governor's Island subsidiary. Prior to this, he was a Transportation and Environmental Policy Advisor to the New York City Mayor's Office. He also served as an Assistant Commissioner for Policy at the New York City Department of Transportation. Prior to his government service, Mr. Flesher worked in strategic planning and private banking at Shearson Lehman American Express. A longtime resident of Manhattan's West Village, he now lives in downtown Albany. Peter?
Thank you for that great introduction, but also thank you to the people here in Binghamton, to Amelia, to Tariq, to Mary, and the people, I'm sure many names that I'm not familiar with, who put on today's great conference. I think really high quality discussion, great involvement, great attendance, and so I'm very pleased to be part of this. And my role for the afternoon is essentially to facilitate the discussion of the gentleman to my right. I just wanted to put a little bit more highlight on what my organization does. Again, we're called Empire State Future. We're a statewide smart growth advocacy coalition. There are 44 organizations statewide, including BRISC here in Binghamton, the Sustainable Communities Group. We focus on economic revitalization, and the emphasis here is not just urban areas. We are just as concerned as town centers and main streets, because anywhere there's greater density, there can be greater economic activity, greater cultural and social life for the community. Last year, we were very involved in helping to pass the Public Infrastructure Policy Act, which is a bill that is now law, and it instructs all state agencies, public authorities, and public corporations. It's all the folks who've got real money. And it tells them to take all of their infrastructure spending and align it with smart growth criteria. Now, that's a really far-ranging bill that affects almost every penny that is in the infrastructure agencies. There is a loophole. A commissioner can say in writing and justify that, well, we're not going to turn away these 3,000 high-paying, high-tech jobs, but we did try to get them to go to downtown Binghamton. We did try to get them to go to downtown Utica. They wouldn't do it. We didn't want them to leave the state, so we're going to say it doesn't meet smart growth criteria, but we're not going to throw it away. We were okay with that. It is a loophole, but it's a loophole in a bill that could have far-reaching significance if it's implemented in a very useful, robust way. We have every reason to think the Cuomo administration will take the bill seriously. The language of all their campaign documents reflected it, not just with good quotes, but really the first 20 pages read like a smart growth philosophy. That's not the end of the line. We're waiting to see clear signs that they're making decisions that we would consider good smart growth decisions to build on and use the law. I think that the heart of it, what this law says is there isn't going to be enough infrastructure money to deal with all the infrastructure needs you already have, not to mention the infrastructure acts you'd like to do to become the new engines of growth. So what you have to do is use this bill to turn down the stuff that you might have done in the past that doesn't have enough of a return to the public on its infrastructure investment. The bill allows you to prioritize. The bill allows you to think through what would be a really good investment in a smart growth sense that addresses economic, energy, environment, and equity concerns all at once, rather than doing it, let's say, the old way, for where the first person to come to the spigot gets the infrastructure spending, spends it in a way that may not have a lot of value to folks, and there's not enough money left at the end of the day for uses that might have a much better return to Binghamton, Broome County, and other parts of the state. So that was a big effort last year. This year, we're working to make sure that the Cuomo administration carefully and usefully implements the bill, but we're also working very closely to help see the Land Bank Act passed, and the Land Bank Act, which is now live in front of the legislature, being considered by the Assembly and the Senate, essentially is an extremely good tool for a city or county to deal with its vacant or abandoned properties. So this is something where I know Assemblywoman Lepardo is a co-sponsor of the bill, that the mayor has been thinking about this bill. There are mayors across the state weighing in. It's an important new tool so that the blight that we've seen in any number of these upstate cities and in Long Island, places like Brookhaven, literally all across the state, that blight is not inevitable. It's not a given. There are other states and other cities, Louisville, Kentucky, Flint, Michigan, places in Ohio, where using land banks, they've been able to repurpose not just a few, not just hundreds, but in the case of Flint, Michigan, thousands of formerly vacant properties are now producing real estate value that's good for the people who live next door, good for the property, good for the community, it's taxable, et cetera. So Land Bank Act is a big priority for us this year, along with the Complete Streets Bill. And I'll mention that we are looking at tax increment financing. We're not fully sure yet of all the issues either way. So those are three for this season. That's enough about Empire State Future. Again, I'm thankful for the opportunity. My role is to attempt to facilitate three very bright, informed, active smart growthers to my right. And so we'll start with Paul Byer, who is the director of the Governor's Office for Smart Growth, who played a very key role in making sure the Public Infrastructure Policy Act made it through the legislature last year, was live within the Patterson administration till the point the bill was actually signed, and did a superb job of working with all the government agencies and all the top people in the Patterson administration to make sure that the bill became law. And Paul continues to be at the Department of State, carrying the banner of smart growth across the state agencies and for the state government. So, Paul.
Yep. First, let me say, wow, what a crowd. Great. I counted 125, maybe 150 people. Maybe I'm overcounting. I'm always shocked by that because in the late 90s, mid 90s, when I first started doing this, there were occasions when I showed up to speak and 2 and 3 people attended. In fact, the last time I was here in Binghamton was a beautiful Saturday morning. They were showing a movie on infrastructure. How exciting. At a high school auditorium in the city of Binghamton. I was asked to sit on the panel as I'm driving down. I must say I had doubts as to the number of people who would show up to such an event on a beautiful Saturday. And lo and behold, I showed up, and it was quite a crowd. I came to the conclusion that, number one, they didn't all come out to see me. But number two, that the primary reason they came out, and the primary reason we have such a large, enthusiastic crowd today, is that you've built a culture of smart growth and sustainability here. And you should always stop amidst all of your frustrations with smart growth and sustainability advocacy and give yourselves a pat on the back, because that's a strong culture. There are folks here in the room that have led the charge. Assemblywoman Lepardo, every time I see her, inquires about the state of smart growth and sustainability. Your mayor and his fabulous staff leading the effort, and all the people involved with this conference. Congratulations. It's not easy to build that type of a culture, especially around issues that are difficult to communicate and understand, like land use planning and transportation. For that reason and others, I think I'll echo the words of former Governor Paris Glendening, who coined the phrase smart growth in 1996. He said, "Paul, the wind is at our backs. The wind is at our backs now." And I think that's true. I think we finally have momentum. We have public awareness around issues that were not on people's radar screen 5, 10 years ago, in some cases not even 2 or 3 years ago. I think the wind is at our back for a number of reasons. I, as an employee of the state of New York, am inspired by the passage of the Public Infrastructure Act, Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Not only are we advocating for smart growth now because it's the right thing to do, but for once in some of our long careers of advocating for smart growth, we have the law behind us, and that's a big wind at our backs. We also have a new governor who is serious about enforcing this law to the point where he put a large section on the Infrastructure Act in his campaign documents, and not only has he put that down in words, but he has backed it up with actions going back to his days as HUD secretary, where back in the 90s, he was one of very few public officials that took smart growth seriously and actually incorporated it into the functioning of state government. In many ways, that was the prototype, the genesis of what we're seeing in the federal government right now with President Obama's Sustainable Communities Partnership. So yes, I think the wind is at our backs. And my job, probably more than half of my job, is to ensure that now that we have passed landmark smart growth legislation, that it is enforced and implemented effectively, so that, as Peter said, we don't scare away jobs, we don't get portrayed as no growth advocates, but that we in fact induce jobs and attract people to our communities because of smart infrastructure and land use planning policies. It's growth inducement here in areas like Binghamton and other upstate areas. It's not growth management, it's growth inducement. How do we use smart growth to manage our money better and to attract jobs? And I hope that this act ultimately has that effect. In a nutshell, Peter gave a good summary of what the Smart Growth Infrastructure Act is. In a nutshell, it requires state agencies to review all infrastructure projects through the lens of 10 smart growth principles, and we all know those principles, one of which being the classic definition of sustainable development that was handed down by the United Nations. So those are embedded in law now. Excuse me. Those concepts are embedded in law to the extent that we spend taxpayer dollars on infrastructure investments. Now, before I get into the meat of the law, let's take a step back. Why infrastructure? Why, with a smart growth bill, did we focus exclusively on infrastructure? And here's why. For a long time, there's been a debate, that's sort of a chicken and an egg debate, where some people say, well, don't infrastructure investments and transportation investments induce certain land use outcomes? And on the other side, folks say, no, it's the demand and the building of those land uses that induces certain transportation and infrastructure investments. And the answer to both of those questions is you're right. They play off of each other. There's an intricate connection between land use planning and infrastructure investments. Geoff just gave a great, wherever he is, gave a great primer on that connection. Now, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, is there anybody here that doesn't think land use and infrastructure intersect with each other? Makes a lot of sense. American Planning Association, in one of their publications, made a pretty definitive statement. No single force has had a greater impact on the pattern of land development in American cities in this century, 20th century, than highways. The great Senator Patrick Moynihan, who was also a great urban historian, said highways determine land use, which is another way of saying they settle the future of areas in which they are built. If that's the case, then we should be planning infrastructure and land use together. But we don't. We don't for a number of reasons. We've acted in silos. Transportation experts are concerned about transportation, and land use experts are concerned about land use. The way our system of government is set up, most transportation decisions are made at a different level of government than local home rule, which determines our land use patterns. And despite some pretty heroic efforts to try to bring the two together, we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't linked transportation and land use planning. I believe that this act does that. It doesn't mandate any type of land use, because we can't do that on the state level. But what we can do is control the purse strings, and that may provide the carrot and the little stick, maybe a little twig, to get municipalities and the private sector to incorporate smart growth into their projects before we actually have to review them and potentially deny them. So this bill makes that very important link between land use and transportation that I don't see anywhere else in law. And that's very important. That's the policy backdrop to this. It's also one of the few things we can do on the state level to impact land use. We provide a lot of, at the Department of State, we provide a lot of assistance to promote land use planning, smart growth and land use planning on the local level, but that doesn't always result in the linking of transportation and land use decisions. As an example, I used to be on a planning board up in the upstate town of Amherst, New York, and I remember it was about 2000, 2001, we redid our comprehensive plan, and it was a beautiful plan, a lot of outreach, reflected most of the principles of smart growth, and it was incorporated into our zoning code. But then I looked at our capital infrastructure plan for that year. Okay, so the land use plan said concentrate your investments in your building in the village, in the downtown, right? The capital plan said move your historic town hall out of the downtown to the fringe of the town, and move the senior center out of the downtown to the fringe of the town. That's a good example, firsthand example of where I saw that we don't link land use and transportation all that well. So with that in mind, we passed the Public Infrastructure Act, which sets forth 10 smart growth principles that need to be adhered to in our infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. Rather than treating them as 10 separate principles, I tried to break them down into two broad categories, the where and the how of smart growth. And I'm going to borrow from New Jersey Future. It's an organization like Peter Fleischer's in New Jersey. I think it's one of the best definitions of smart growth at the bottom up here, because it focuses on those two important principles. How do you know smart growth when you see it? Smart growth has two primary features, the where and the how. It happens where development can be accommodated with minimal adverse impact to the environment, and in places where development takes maximum advantage of public investments. Smart growth also addresses how the finished development will work with neighboring development to restore choices that are missing in places marked by sprawl. So with that in mind, let's start with the criteria that relate almost exclusively to location. And it's about 30 to 40% of the criteria relate to location, as you can imagine why. The first three criteria, first criteria under the where category can be called the fix it first policy, and that's what Geoff talked about earlier. Basically, we want to invest in repair and maintenance of existing infrastructure, because if we keep building new, we're going to be inducing sprawl probably. So that's a fix it first policy. Some states have specific laws on fix it first. This happens to be embedded in our Infrastructure Act. The second piece of the bill we spent a lot of time on, defining municipal centers and rewarding projects that revitalize municipal centers. Obviously very important to this conference today. Without reading the entire definition, I took one piece out, areas of concentrated and mixed land uses that serve as centers for various activities, but we also gave specific examples of where you already see smart growth in municipal centers. Transit-oriented development around rail or bus rapid transit, that fits the criteria of smart growth planning principles. Hardship areas, low-income areas, environmental justice areas. At the Department of State, we plan local waterfront revitalization areas. We want to reward those. If we put money into planning these communities correctly, we want to reward them with infrastructure investments. And also central business districts and areas around municipal centers that actually feed into those centers. And the third location criteria are developed areas and infill. As you can see already, there's a lot of overlap among these provisions, but we talk about brownfield opportunity areas, infill areas, places targeted for redevelopment in municipal plans. So that's the where of smart growth. Next slide, please. Now we get into the how. Well, the next criteria, criteria number 4, deal with neighborhood design and planning. You know these already. This is the simple list of the planning principles that strike at the core of smart growth. Mixed uses, compact communities, higher density, downtown revitalization, brownfields redevelopment, a big thing, accessible and well-maintained public spaces. The last one, age and income diversity. Equity is a huge part of smart growth, of course, but we also fit age-friendly communities into that category too. With the population trends that Geoff talked about earlier, we have to build for an aging community. Smart growth satisfies that demographic. Next slide is mobility choices. You've heard a lot about that already. We simply want to reduce auto dependence. A project, an infrastructure project, should induce land uses that are walkable, bikeable, and transit-friendly, and they should in and of themselves be planned to be walkable, bikeable, and transit-friendly. All right, here's something to think about. I'm always asked about this law in regards to the state's, what's called SEQR, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. It's what all development has to go through before it's approved by a local municipal body. And they say to me, well, isn't this provision, isn't this part the same as SEQR? It really is not. Here's why. You'll see some words up here that relate directly to things that are already reviewed in the development process under SEQR. Agricultural land, soil, surface and groundwater, air quality, historic resources. They are all reviewed under the SEQR Act, but let me tell you something, sitting on a town planning board for 5 years, they don't reflect smart growth principles. There's a lot of sprawl that makes it through SEQR that is not smart growth. And here's why, here's the distinction I make. SEQR represents minimization. You're minimizing adverse environmental impacts, right? Smart growth I see as optimization. You're going beyond SEQR, you're going beyond traditional environmental protection to actually enhance the environment through natural water functions. I was told not to use the word hydrologic too much. Green infrastructure would be examples, internal circulation systems within pervious internal transportation systems that manage water. Those sorts of things actually enhance the land that you're developing on. So there is a big distinction there, I think. Hope the courts will back me up. The next slide, very, very important. If you think about, when I think back, the beginnings of the smart growth movement may have started in 2 areas, the movement for walkable communities and the movement for community-based planning. Community-based planning is a system of planning that does extensive, inclusive outreach. It's mainstream now, but 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't. When comprehensive plans were developed, they were done with the minimal attention to public outreach, hearings, things like that, maybe mailings if you were lucky. Now, community-based planning is a very sophisticated science that does as much outreach up front so that in the end you have community buy-in into a project. And in one of the criteria in the Smart Growth Act actually says the project should be a result of community-based planning and intermunicipal planning. Regional planning, another big component of smart growth. And there's a piece later in the bill that I love, and I could thank Assembly Member Sam Hoyt for putting this in. He was the sponsor, the primary sponsor in the Assembly. Assemblywoman Lepardo was a co-sponsor on the bill. The bill says that you must solicit input from and consult with various representatives of affected communities and organizations. Now, I've gotten this question from a lot of agencies. What does that mean? Haven't we already done outreach if we've done seeker? Haven't we already solicited input? And my response is, well, now, if you have, you've got to do it again. This requires state agencies to actually reach out to affected communities and ask for their input on a project. Now, it doesn't say that they have to take that input, right? But the mere act of doing the solicitation, I think, is a step in the right direction. So we're doing some training internally in state agencies on exactly what we mean by that, making a distinction between your traditional form of outreach and what we know of community outreach now. That's the process part of this. And now we get to the overarching, next slide, thank you, principle of sustainability. This bill actually has the definition of sustainable development in it. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now again, I get state agency lawyers looking at me and saying, how the heck do I implement that? I don't know with precision right now, but we're working through it, and it's certainly a concept that we should all be used to at this point. Green buildings are sustainable development. Downtown revitalization is sustainable. So we're working with agencies now to lay out all the possibilities, the fiscal sustainability, economic sustainability, as well as the social and environmental sustainability behind the project. This, to me, is one of the more exciting pieces of the bill because it is an overarching concept that really should infiltrate into so many different areas of state government, the idea of sustainability, planning now for the future. Simple concept, but in the past we have strayed from that concept. I'm inspired by some of the comments and some of the support that we are getting from the federal government for this type of thing, for this type of law. I think the timing of this law is perfect because at the same time we have a president who is promoting sustainable communities on an interagency basis through the smart growth, through the Sustainable Communities Partnership. And Ray LaHood, this is a US DOT commissioner now, I'm going to quote, on livability and on the connection between land use and transportation, said, once politicians begin to listen to their constituents, they will realize a sustainable course is what voters want. I think that's true. They will find constituents way ahead on livability and sustainability, on having cleaner, greener communities, on having walking and biking paths, and on having streetcar systems. That quote from an interview with Grist magazine. It's good to hear that sort of thing coming from the federal government because then we know we have support here in New York for what we have already done through the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Act. And my last slide will be just a brief overview of the process that was established in the law to implement it. And this is very interesting. When I first got this job as Smart Growth Director, one of my dreams, and this was a pie-in-the-sky dream, was that every state agency would have a Smart Growth Director or a planner who would make sure that that agency is thinking in terms of land use planning and smart growth in their operations. I think we got something better than that in this law. Every infrastructure agency, every agency that invests in infrastructure must set up a Smart Growth Advisory Committee. And I'm encouraging the agencies to set up interdisciplinary advisory committees so that they're sharing information across disciplinary lines. Planners are talking to environmentalists who are talking to engineers and making these final decisions because those are the entities that have to do what are called smart growth impact statements. These entities have to make sure, to the extent practicable, and that's the loophole that Peter alluded to earlier. There's a practicability standard here in the law. To the extent practicable, these interdisciplinary agency groups have to review these projects through the smart growth lens. I think that's tremendously important, that you have a body built into every state agency almost like a smart growth cabinet, reviewing spending and other policies. Beyond that, we are also interacting across agency lines. I have a very active and vocal group of state agency representatives that now includes lawyers. We really didn't have lawyers involved in this until the law passed, and that makes sense. So we're enculturating and educating a whole new group of professionals in state government, and we interact with one another because we're trying to provide some type of uniformity across state agencies and ensure that there's communication across state agencies so we don't fall back into that trap of viewing these decisions in silos, in narrow terms. So what do I think this law will do, or what do I hope it does? I mean, that was a kind of a dry overview of what the law is and how we implement it, but to me as a lawyer, I always think that the law is a living, breathing document. It was a product of a history, a social and political history, and it should yield social and political results. At the very least, this bill will be a thought changer and already has been. Agencies that didn't think about land use outcomes in infrastructure policies now have to do that. There's no question about that. I think it's a behavior changer, especially in state agencies who now have to make decisions about money, not just review them, but make final decisions based on smart growth. So it's definitely a thought changer. It's definitely a behavior changer. What it really should be in the end is a game changer. And the only way that's going to happen is if municipalities and developers and the business community and local advocates like you build these principles into your operations, build them into your projects and your land use zonings early on so that you don't have to come in at the back end and wonder why your project was denied by a DOT or an Empire State Development. If this bill changes land use patterns on the local level, and land use planning and zoning on the local level, then it will have reached its potential. And that's what we have to strive for. Again, there's no mandate on local governments, but we will be doing outreach, and I have been doing outreach all over the state, encouraging localities to work with the state to try to get in ahead of the game and actually change their land use planning and practices. I solicit your help, I solicit your input in that monumental task. This is not easy. I find now that advocacy is much easier than enforcement. But in this process, I think we'll come out a lot stronger. We'll have a lot more buy-in to smart growth if we get in early and make this new law a behavior changer. And I look forward to doing that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure to be the advocate introducing and following the person working for the administration, but in this case, we have a true believer in smart